Hello, you're watching HealthDay Now. I'm Mabel Jong. The Food and Drug Administration approved the Biogen Aducanumab drug last month, making it the first Alzheimer's medication available in nearly 20 years, and the only one that could potentially slow the progression of the disease. Alzheimer's now affects over 6 million Americans. Aducanumab, which goes by the brand name Aduhelm, is not a cure for Alzheimer's, and it does not reverse it. But data shows the drug does break up sticky plaques of protein, amyloid, that accumulate in the brain, a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. Some experts expect that if the drug can help remove those plaques, it may help to slow the rate of cognitive decline for those in the early stages of the disease. The FDA's approval, however, comes with conditions and controversy. Here with me now is Dr. G. Gerald Alexander, an associate professor at Johns Hopkins who studies drug safety. Dr. Alexander served on the FDA advisory committee that reviewed the Biogen drug. Dr. Alexander, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, despite the FDA advisory committee's nearly unanimous decision against approving this new drug, the FDA gave its okay. Is that strange? Is it unusual for the FDA to ignore a clear-cut recommendation from an advisory group?
Well, of course, the FDA isn't bound by any advisory committee's recommendations, although they usually, maybe 8 out of 10 cases, rule in the direction that the advisory committee recommends. I think what made this case particularly unusual is the amount of consensus among the advisory committee. There was nearly unanimous opinion that there was not substantial evidence of safety and efficacy for Aducanumab.
Okay, so what do you think was driving their decision? Why did they approve the drug?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that a lot more remains to be seen, both in terms of better understanding the FDA's decision-making process, as well as figuring out where we go from here. There's no question that there's an enormous amount of unmet need and an enormous hunger and thirst for new treatments for this common and devastating condition.
Mm-hmm.
But that unmet need should drive investments in the research and development enterprise, not a lowering of our standards that Americans rely on to know that their drugs are safe and effective.
Let's get to the research. At the center of the research is the amyloid hypothesis, the ability of the drug to break up the clumps of amyloid protein. Can the drug do this, and why is it important?
Well, there is plenty of evidence that the drug reduces amyloid levels. There's not a lot of controversy about that. I think where things become much more nebulous is whether or not amyloid is a valid surrogate. And that was one of the many surprising twists and turns in the story of Aducanumab, namely that ultimately the FDA approved the product using its accelerated pathway. In other words, based on a supposition that amyloid is a valid surrogate. And I think that there is a lot of reason to be skeptical as to whether that is actually the case.
So really, there isn't a bottom line here that if I asked, does this drug work, we still don't really know.
Well, I think the jury's still out. I mean, it's hard to find a scientist that would argue otherwise. In other words, if there's one thing that there's pretty much agreement on, it may not be whether or not the drug should have been approved, but it's that there simply isn't good evidence to support, or what I should say, substantial evidence, which is a regulatory threshold of safety and effectiveness of this product.
Okay, so what is your advice to families? We're on a moving train here. The drug is going to be marketed. In fact, Biogen has spent so much money on some of these campaigns, really educating the public about this drug. What do you want the public to know?
Well, I'm a practicing internist and I have patients with Alzheimer's disease in my own primary care practice. And so I understand and believe that patients and their loved ones and clinicians are going to have some hard conversations going forward. Now, we have seen some clinicians and indeed some health systems indicate that they weren't going to be offering the drug. And I think that this really comes down to individual doctors and nurses and patients and loved ones navigating these waters together. There's no way around it. I mean, there's no other option than to have this conversation and to discuss the evidence. And those discussions are going to be complicated, but it's something that I think patients and clinicians and loved ones can do.
Now, because the drug was approved as part of the FDA's accelerated process, Biogen must conduct a randomized controlled trial to verify its efficacy, a post-approval trial to verify benefit. Is that routine? And what is the status of that? Is it possible that the FDA will rescind its approval if the subsequent trials show poor results?
Well, I mean, there's a bit to unpack there. So they do have to conduct a confirmatory trial. I suppose that's the good news. The bad news is that the CEO of Biogen has said that he estimates or believes that the trial will be completed and reported out by 2030. I think 9 years is a heck of a long time to have to wait in order to understand whether this drug even works.
Sure. And in the meantime, there's quite a large financial burden that will be put on the healthcare system.
Massive. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the headlines, the size of the budget of NASA devoted to this product. I mean, it's unfathomable. So, you know, I think one thing that's safe to say is that there are many chapters to the story that have yet to be written. We have yet to understand how this product ultimately was approved and what the nature of the relationship was between the FDA and the manufacturer and other parties that may have had some hand in shaping the way that the product was approved and reviewed and ultimately approved.
Has your faith in the agency been shaken?
Well, listen, I do a lot of work for the FDA, and I am proud of the FDA. I think that they get an extraordinary amount right. I have seen the high respect and high regard that regulators around the world hold the FDA in. So I know that the FDA is filled with thousands of outstanding scientists and staff that work tirelessly. And I think that's one of the things that makes this case so striking, is that it's at such odds with the typically good work and the good science that the FDA does. I think it's too early to know exactly if the FDA, you know, takes a sort of a permanent hit with respect to its reputation. It's almost an unanswerable question. And I don't even know if it's the most important one. I think the really important question is, how did this happen? How can we prevent it from happening again? And how can we best support patients with Alzheimer's disease and their loved ones who are navigating this common and often devastating disease?
So, Dr. Alexander, there has been adjustments to the labeling. Does this matter?
I think it's important. Keep in mind that the label was initially for all patients with Alzheimer's disease, whereas the clinical trials that were performed were limited to patients with mild cognitive impairment or mild Alzheimer's disease. But what the label still doesn't get right is that it doesn't stipulate that you have to have demonstrated elevated levels of beta amyloid. Well, participating in the trials required that you had elevated levels of beta amyloid. And this is so important because up to half of people with mild cognitive impairment and up to a third of people with a presumptive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease don't actually have elevated beta amyloid levels.
And also, Dr. Alexander, there's a growing number of health systems who have come out and said that they will not offer this drug. And also, we're looking at the Medicare system evaluating whether they're going to pay for the drug in the end. What are those two forces going to do to the availability of this Biogen drug?
I think the fact that health systems like the Cleveland Clinic have been willing to state that they're not going to administer this product is just a testament to just how questionable the science is that this product is resting on.
All right, Dr. Alexander, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Dr. G. Caleb Alexander, professor at Johns Hopkins and member of the FDA Advisory Committee. The FDA's green light for Aducanumab in the wake of growing controversy over efficacy may upend research and clinical practice. In research settings, many scientists wonder if this decision will set a precedent for future approvals without sufficient data, and whether it will help or hamper research into other drugs. In treatment settings, physicians are facing a flood of calls from patients and their families who want the drug, but some are already saying they're not going to prescribe it. With me now is Dr. Anton Porsteinsson, Director of the Alzheimer's Disease Care Research and Education Program at the University of Rochester Medical Center. He has spent the past 10 plus years as the principal investigator of the clinical trial for the Biogen drug, and this past year, he was hired as a consultant for Biogen. Also here is Dr. Ken Lin, primary care physician with Georgetown Medical Center and an editor of the American Family Physician Journal. Thank you to you both.
Thanks, Mabel.
Dr. Thorstenson, let's start with you. Why so much controversy over the approval of this drug?
So at the end of the day, you have studies that contradict each other. Some people believe that you can salvage them and that the results are meaningful for a disease that has no effective treatments, especially not disease-modifying treatments. And others feel that you should meet a high standard in terms of having two studies that are consistent in terms of their results, that were executed according to the original plan, and that there shouldn't be any discount given on how the statistical analysis is done.
Those studies that you mentioned, the advisory committee took a look at those studies and decided, voting nearly unanimously, that there just wasn't enough data to approve this drug. So were you surprised that the FDA did decide in the end to grant approval?
So basically the FDA agreed with the advisory board that these studies that kind of countered each other did not prove unequivocally that the drug was effective.
The basis of the approval was on the antibody's ability to decrease amyloid plaque, and that the decrease in plaque would show that the drug works, a biomarker. But reducing amyloid is not the same thing as slowing symptoms of dementia. So what should patients expect from this drug?
Here there's a controversy. Is it undisputable that lowering amyloid leads to a benefit? And I would say there is data to suggest that it does, but that data isn't beyond question. So it's an early path to take, and we're going to need to get clinical data. We're going to need to get additional clinical data on Biogen's Aducanumab.
Dr. Lin, what is being suggested here, that more research needs to be done, but yet this drug will be out on the market and will be ready for physicians to write prescriptions for it. The majority of primary care physicians surveyed recently are already saying that they do not plan to prescribe it. Why?
There are two reasons, Mabel, that I and many of my colleagues feel negatively toward prescribing the drug. One is, I think, the question about efficacy. I agree with Dr. Thorstenson that more research needs to be done. It's not unequivocal, really, either way. The two studies did conflict, but the feeling is that almost as if the FDA moved the goalposts there. That you have these studies that were originally designed to focus on clinical outcomes, cognitive preservation or deterioration. And then when those were inconclusive, they kind of reached for this other outcome, which is the amyloid plaque that you mentioned, that many other drugs have shown to have effects on, but not actually have any clinical effects. I think this is a little bit different from the cancer scenario, where it's true that many cancer drugs do get approved based on a surrogate outcome that isn't a clinical outcome. But in those cases, many of those trials were not even designed to find that clinical outcome. And unfortunately, many of those drugs subsequently are shown to not be as effective as they might have been claimed in the beginning, because when the data finally does come in, the surrogate outcome maybe isn't that great a marker for the clinical outcome or the patient-oriented outcome that we care about. I think the cost is another consideration, but it's probably a secondary consideration. If I felt the drug was effective, then the cost would be, something to think about independently. But I think that just sort of adds, insult to injury on top of not knowing if it works. It's going to cost, an arm and a leg and costs that patients aren't going to be able to afford.
Now, despite the insufficient evidence of the drug's benefits, possible painful side effects, and the cost that you brought up, do you believe that there will be a lot of pressure from patients and their families to prescribe the drug?
Patients are going to look at it and say, why not? Like if there's this new drug and it might work, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, as we all know. And if there's something that gives people hope, they're going to grasp for it.
Major health organizations like Mount Sinai and the Cleveland Clinic have already come out and said that they're not going to offer the drug. So will that limit the availability of Aduhelm to patients who desperately want to start somewhere?
You would better say, look, we have serious concerns about this. We want to be vocal about that. I have no issue with a doctor saying to their patients, and many of my colleagues are doing that exactly. They have serious concerns about the data. They have patients that want to consider this treatment. They sit down with them. They give them both sides of this story. They are very blunt about the fact that they may be skeptical. But a lot of them are saying, at the end of the day, if my patient decides that he wants a drug that has been approved, I will assist with that, because I will not kind of abandon the patient in that situation. That, to me, is an honorable way of doing things. I don't like how Cleveland Clinic is handling this.
Dr. Lin, yes, Dr. Thorstenson agrees more research needs to be done, and there is going to be another trial. Although once you get a drug out into the marketplace, there are skeptics that trial will even happen. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, the FDA doesn't have a great record of post-approval following up on the trials. I think that's kind of been shown across many other drugs that received accelerated approval or approval based on surrogates. I think one thing we haven't talked about is, obviously the clinical impact and the financial impact of the drug is going to depend largely on whether private insurers and Medicare choose to cover the drug. Private insurers may be able to negotiate a discount off the sticker price, but Medicare, unfortunately, is legislatively prohibited from doing that. They can basically cover the drug with conditions. They may cover the drug pending further research or what's called evidence development, or they can choose not to cover it, but they can't go to Biogen and say, well, like cut the price of the drug by 80% and then we'll pay for it. And that's a flaw in our health system. But it's a limitation that we're going to have to deal with. I think if coverage ends up not being terribly generous, if a lot of patients are paying for this, or at least a substantial proportion out of pocket, patients are going to have to balance that cost with what else could that money do for the patient. I mean, for $56,000 a year, you could hire caregivers, you could, enroll someone in cognitive stimulation or an exercise program. You could, there are many other things that can help with patients with mild cognitive dysfunction or early dementia that are not drug related, that the money might be better spent.
Dr. Thorstenson, would you agree with Dr. Lin that there are effective and more economical ways that are currently available in primary care strategies and treatments to address a mild form of Alzheimer's disease?
So look, there's more than just medications. In this disease, and just about any disease, you are talking about lifestyle changes, you're talking about changes in diet, changes in exercise, you're talking about bringing in supports, et cetera, et cetera. we always take a holistic approach to the treatment of people with Alzheimer's disease. And I totally agree in terms of maybe this will be one of the tipping points that end up allowing federal programs, and especially Medicare, to negotiate drug prices. That I would fully support. And the price tag here is high. There is no question about that. There's nothing that I'm going to say that you know, that basically lends credence to the price. That's a high price. So, you know, this is not a drug for everyone. You got to think about, we need to be good stewards of healthcare dollars. We also need to move the field forward. And I feel fairly confident that this has reinvigorated interest in Alzheimer's disease. It has brought companies back to you know, exploring options in the field that they had kind of started to abandon because they said there is no path forward.
Okay, Dr. Ken Lim, thank you. I've been speaking with Dr. Anton Thorstenson, Director of the Alzheimer's Disease Care Research and Education Program at the University of Rochester Medical Center, and Dr. Ken Lim, Primary Care Physician with Georgetown Medical Center and an editor at the American Family Physician Journal. Thank you to you both.
Thanks, Mabel. Thanks, Ken. Good discussion.
It's nice to be here.
And that's it from me. I'm Mabel Jong. Thanks for watching HealthDay Now.